Hey everybody, welcome on back. My name is Matt, Cryptic if you prefer, and today we're going to go look at part 2 in the grapes series. Today I'm going to be going over how I textured the grapes, what sort of processes I followed, and how I got everything set up in Substance Painter before I brought it over into Maya for rendering, which will be the next video. So if you're new here, welcome on in, or if you're returning, welcome back. And if you could for a minute, just take a second, hit that like button. It does help the channel a lot. And if you haven't followed yet, feel free to follow. But let's go ahead and dive into this, and I'll start going over how I went about creating this. Okay, so just getting everything kind of set up and imported. It's always kind of the initial setup when we get into Substance Painters. You got to go bake your materials, get all that stuff taken care of, and then the first thing I started doing was just trying to figure out what sort of basic shading I was going to be working with. So I kind of tried to find my coloring at the beginning, which is how I start most of my texturing. I always try to make sure that I have some base color to work off of, and then I start adding in layers. So here we're working on kind of a little bit of opacity and a little bit of gloss just to try to get that more shiny grape look, and then I start to add new layers. One of the big things that I do now is I create a layer above that layer, and I use roughness on a separate layer. That way I have a little bit more control over it than just slapping it into the same material. I find it helps me a little bit more. But this is how I start to kind of give the tones of the skin's surface, the skin of the grape, like the surface actually changing with the light. So you can see how the light itself kind of distorts a little bit with the roughness map. And then here I wanted to add a little bit of height. I actually had a lot of issues here just because of the way these were UV'd, but I ended up kind of just settling with a spherical projection and allowing it to create the wrinkles that I was kind of going for anyway. I did end up toning that portion down quite a bit at the end, just because it was almost a little too heavy, but it was something that I wanted to have, because if you ever look at grapes, they're pretty imperfect. Like, they have bruises, they have wrinkles, they have sometimes tears, like they have all sorts of different weird little issues with them, and so I really wanted to try to replicate that. So here's one of the first passes that I did of adding some differentiation to the skin color of the grape, because I wanted to make sure that the skin actually had layers. Normally you could do this procedurally, and later on in this video I did do a little bit of this procedurally, but sometimes I like to go through with just a first pass and do some hand painting. I'm a big fan of hand painting my textures. I just enjoy the process of it. I think it's a lot of fun and it's relaxing. And you can see how I take that and I pull the tone down a little bit just to give that subtle skin difference. And I didn't want to leave these really heavy dark marks. This was something that was really interesting to me, is that if you ever look at grapes, each one of them has this little dot on the bottom of them. So I wanted to make sure I added that dot. Usually what I'll do is I'll start heavy so I can see where I'm putting them. And then once I'm done with adding the kind of the heavy little details, I'll go back through and just kind of blur them and pull them back a bit. That way they don't look like they're standing out so much, because right now if you were to have rendered it this way, those black dots would stand out a lot. But when we pull them back and we add a little bit of subtlety to them, it just kind of creates a more organic look to it. So you can see here I'm starting to kind of just pull that back a little bit and just shade it a tad. I wanted to make sure that they still existed there. They still had the little indent, but they weren't really necessarily popping out at you. The other thing I did here was I wanted to add some surface blemishes. These are just little dots that appear on the bodies of grapes. I don't know why, they're just there, so I wanted to replicate that. And I follow the same process here. I start really dark and then I go really light. So depending on how much of that detail I actually want to shine through, I'll either keep or remove a little bit. But generally this is something I hand paint, just because, again, it's a process I enjoy doing, and I feel like it gives a little bit less of a uniform look. This way I have control over which grapes have what, and it just gave me a lot more sort of moving room to work with those. So here's where I started to play more with some procedural surface noise, just to kind of break the skin up even further. This is just one of the many ways you can do this. I just choose to do it this way. I used an anchor point to reach down to a gray channel to pull that information through, and then I just kind of adjusted it as I needed to. I also used this to add some dust layer to the grapes, because you ever get fresh grapes from the store, they usually have some sort of layer of dust because they weren't pre-washed. which is, why we wash our grapes. But this is where I started moving over to the branch. I wanted to really figure out how I could get this to work properly. The branch was a tough one. I went through a couple iterations on the branch because initially I wanted to start off with like a very live, like these were just fresh picked, and it was just only starting to kind of die off because most of the time when we get grapes from the store, the branch is already well dead. But I wanted to have a little bit of life in there. It ended up kind of contrasting really poorly with the grapes, and so I ended up actually pulling that information back and darkening it quite a bit. But here I'm just kind of hand painting in some detail and just adding more degradation to the color of the branch because, again, I wanted it to be somewhat alive but also somewhat dead. This is, again, something that I decided to hand paint. Probably could have done it procedurally, but I just decided I didn't want to. There's a lot that I'll do, and overall, I think I only spent like maybe 2-3 hours texturing these. So like really time-wise, dedication-wise, it really wasn't too much. I spent most of my time on this project rendering. One of the big things that I just wanted to kind of convey is that I wanted the branch to be dying out from the grapes because that's usually how it kind of works. It gradually dries up along the way. So the buds themselves, I went through and actually textured them pretty heavily dark along with a little bit of height map data. I talked about it in the first video, but I only wanted to add a certain amount of data information to the model itself because I knew the rest of it would be handled by like bump and height to give you that kind of detail of the connection point of the grape to the stem. And that's kind of what I did here. This is just, again, kind of me working with some height, trying to add a little bit of texture to the stem itself. This was actually a pretty big struggle because of the different orientations of all the UV shells, and I couldn't really find a good way to get everything to match up properly. So I ended up staying with a really subtle kind of height map to it. And then here we are hand painting all the buds. It does seem like it would be tedious, and it was, a little bit tedious, but in the end, I feel like the result that I get from doing this tedious work is a lot better than had I just like procedurally done it. I think it shows better, and I think it just kind of plays a little bit more to the realism of it instead of having these identical points all over the model that were just procedurally generated. This is one of those things with texturing where I always tell people, like, make sure you take your time, spend the time doing the things that you need to do and, pay attention to your reference. Look at the way these things work. One of the big things that I see all the times is like people don't necessarily spend enough time looking at the reference and establishing like, oh, okay, this is how this actually looks and this is how, like, say this plant dies off. These are all different things that we can study, and they give us different indications of like how texture should work on these sorts of models. And again, just adding a little bit more detail and trying to figure out the exact shading that I wanted on the stem. This is where I started to establish that maybe having it a little bit more dead was going to add a little bit more contrast to the grapes versus the vine. I didn't make that final change in this until rendering later on, where I actually went back into Substance Painter and I adjusted it, just because I couldn't get it to work properly. So I wanted to make sure that I had a little bit more contrast between the grapes and the stem, because everything was bleeding together. And so that's something that you may find later on when you're working on projects like this, is that maybe you textured something and something isn't working necessarily. That's why I always end up going back and just kind of adjusting things and tweaking things. So it's really good to have a workflow where you can go back and forth if you need. And then again, just adding a little bit of a dust layer just to kind of sell the idea that this was, you know, just freshly picked from the vine, or you picked it up from the store and it had a little bit of dust left on it. Whatever the case may be, there's always a good use of a little bit of a dust layer just to kind of add that extra layer of realism to a texture. And it's something that I always try to do if I can fit it in there, if it makes sense. So you can see that here I'm trying to add just some variation with the grapes. All the grapes were the same color. I wanted to make sure there were some that were necessarily like not green, maybe a little yellow, a little brown. Especially these little baby grapes on the branches, I wanted them to be a little bit less developed than, you know, the nice big juicy green ones. And so adding this color variation just kind of helps sell the idea that, you know, this is a bunch of grapes that was picked and grown outside. Like, it's not perfect, it's an imperfect thing. And that's what we're trying to show here. These were some of the final passes that I did in trying to establish what the texture I wanted was, and I tried to match the color of the grapes a little bit better and just kind of figure out where I wanted everything to rest here. And then this final piece is just adding the little bit of bruising that you get around the top of the grape, where the stem actually connects to the grape, because the fruit hangs from this, it grows from this area stretches and conforms, and when you pull it, it breaks. There's a whole lot of stuff that happens there that I wanted to convey a little bit on the texture, so I just wanted to darken these areas a tad bit with a little bit of yellowing. If you ever pull a grape off of a stem, you'll see something kind of like this. This is just kind of part of the study itself that I wanted to make sure that I showed, is that, you know, these are details that you wouldn't necessarily see unless somebody's like going in and pulling the model apart and like looking at all the different things. But there is a subtle shading to it, and if you look close enough, you'll see it. It's an important detail. It's kind of what helps allow for like super close zooms to show like just the amount of detail that's in these little individual fruits. And it's just something I wanted to include, and it is, again, something I wanted to hand paint, just because it's kind of where I draw my like artistic process from in this one, is I do enjoy actually hand painting textures. And then after this, I get everything exported out and sent off for rendering. All of these textures were 8K. I wanted as much detail as possible, which is why I did that. Okay, and that's the end of this one. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it. I hope you learned something. I hope you learned a little bit more into like the process on how I did these grapes. I think it was a really fun project to texture, and it was something I actually really enjoyed. The next video will be on rendering. If you are a YouTube member, that video is going to be a member exclusive. So if you want to join, support the channel, that's going to be the best way to do it. You'll get access to that video, as well as Patreon. If you want to join me on Patreon, that video will also be live on my Patreon, where you can get free models as well. So either way, you can support the channel and support what I do here. I do really appreciate it, and I, again, try to keep things as free and open as possible, but I do have to find kind of a middle ground here. So the next video will be exclusive to members only, but again, it'll be live on both my Patreon and my YouTube. So whatever platform you prefer, you can join there. If this is a video that you really want to see, those are really great options, and there will be more member exclusive videos going forward that kind of help show a little bit more of the technical side of things that I don't necessarily record, because the next video is going to be a deep dive into how I set up my materials, including subsurface scattering, how I set up my lights, how I set up my cameras, all of that. It's going to be kind of a deep dive into what went into making this what it was, because this was honestly one of the most complex rendering projects that I have ever done. So if you're interested in that, please make sure you subscribe and make sure you join as a member, because that will be available to you by the end of the week. So with that said, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you being here, and I will see you all in the next one.